Hello, my name is Caleb Denby, and welcome back to Game Review. Today, we're going to be going over a game between Fabiano Caruana and Alexander Grischuk. This game, of course, from the 2018 candidates, shows once again why Fabiano is one of the best in the world at classical chess. Of course, he won the 2018 candidates and went on to challenge Magnus Carlsen for the World Championship title. Now, this game started with e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, of course, entering the Petrov defense. This is one of the key openings that led Fabiano to actually win the 2018 candidates with this Petrov. Of course, he won quite a few key games in this opening. Knight takes e5 is the main line, but in the game, Alexander Grischuk actually chose the move d4. And this move immediately challenges the center in a little bit of a different manner than knight takes e5. Of course, the downside to d4 is you did not defend your e-pawn, and Fabiano simply captures. Now, after d takes e5, we see d5 from black, and both sides now have a pawn in the center. Knight bd2 comes, challenging this knight. Now, this knight really can't stay on the e4 square for too long, otherwise it is just going to get captured. So knight takes d2, bishop takes d2, bishop e7, bishop d3, now c5, and c3, and after knight c6, I will pause here for just a moment. And so we kind of see the key imbalance in the game. White is trying to claim that he has a slight edge due to this advanced e-pawn on e5. Meanwhile, black's pawns are a little bit more compact, a little bit more connected, and they are still fighting for the center, although white is trying his best not to allow black to gain similar space with the move d4. So what we see here is black is going to try to take advantage of this e5 pawn by proving it's a little bit overextended. You can expect moves like bishop g4, threatening to actually capture this pawn. And meanwhile, white is going to use this pawn as a spatial edge to try and prove that these bishops are going to be just too powerful for black to handle. In the game, white finished development with castles, and black brought this bishop out to g4, as expected. Now, rook e1 is a good supporting move to support this pawn on e5, and queen d7 is black's choice. h3 from white kicks this bishop away, so bishop h5, and now bishop f4. You see the white pieces all supporting this advanced e-pawn, trying to keep this pawn as the just annoying thorn in black's side that he can't get rid of. Fabi played queen e6, blockading the pawn. Now a3 is Grischuk's choice, and black gets castled. And so this is kind of the end of the opening phase here. And with this pawn on e5, Grischuk does the classical idea of a spatial advantage in the center. One idea with this spatial advantage is that it cuts the black pieces in half. And what do I mean by this? I mean, it cuts this bishop off from the queen side of the board, it cuts this knight off from the king side of the board. And with this idea, hopefully, with the space advantage, you can cut these pieces off and then focus your pieces on one side of the board. So Grischuk tries to play on this queen side while the black pieces are a little bit stuck over here on h5. In the meantime, though, Fabi plays very naturally. He ignores this b4 pawn and plays h6. This bishop actually drops back to g3. And now we see the move b6 from Fabi. So Fabi just keeps everything nice and solid, doesn't allow white to open too many files on this queen side and take advantage of this e5 pawn. Now, white plays a very interesting move, and that move is knight to d4. So of course, if you take this knight, we take your bishop, and if you take d1, as was played in the game, simply knight takes e6, f takes e6, and rook a takes d1. And what has white achieved with this maneuver? Well, he's gained the bishop pair. And how should you play against the bishop pair as black? You, of course, shouldn't open diagonals, you should not open lines, you should close things down, which is why we see the move c4 from Fabi, bishop c2, and now b5. And so what Fabi has done is the ideal way to play against these bishops. This bishop is on some open diagonals, but all of these squares are covered by the white pawns. Meanwhile, this bishop isn't so impressive, staring at its own pawn on e5. So as always, you want to close things down against the bishops. White plays a4, trying to break down this b5 pawn. Of course, we want to keep things closed, so simply a6, defending b5. Now f3 is Grischuk's choice, trying to reroute this bishop. We see bishop g5 from black, very natural move, getting this bishop onto an active square. Bishop f2, and now bishop f4 is putting annoying pressure on this e5 pawn. Bishop c5 attacks this rook, so rook f to d8. And now bishop d6, so we see an interesting idea here, where white's bishop is posted up in black's camp, and black's bishop is posted up in the white camp after bishop g3. This rook comes to e2, and now g5. And the fact is, Fabiano has simply outplayed Alexander Grischuk so far in this game. While white does have the bishops, this bishop actually turns out to be a little bit of a ghost. It's just looking at nothing on either side of the board. And so while we tend to say that the good bishop is the bishop on the opposite color as our pawns, so in this case these pawns and this bishop, but there's nothing for this bishop to do. It just looks at thin air on both sides of the board. Meanwhile, black's pieces make a ton of sense. They work together to pressure this e5 pawn. The game continued with king f1, and now king f7, naturally getting the kings into the game. Bishop c7 from white attacks this rook, simply rook e8, and Grischuk already starts repeating moves. Fabi isn't happy with a draw in this case, though. And I also want to talk a little bit, the tournament situation in this case, this was the final round of the candidates, and with a draw, Fabi would force a playoff, actually, at the very least. And likely, he would simply win outright, unless one of his chasers actually managed to win in the last round. But Fabi was not happy with the draw. He played on, trying to win the game. After rook a1, this rook comes back to d8. We see bishop b1, and now rook d7 from Fabi, just getting these rooks a little bit more mobile. Rook a3 was Grischuk's choice, and now the key breakthrough in the position finally comes through. Of course, everybody at home sees it. What's the key pawn break for black? It is d4. This is black's idea to keep the game going, to get this pawn mobile on the c-file and get this knight into the game. A takes b5 is played, a takes b5, takes on d4, knight takes d4, and now black has a powerful, protected, passed c-pawn. Say that 3 times fast. Powerful, protected, passed c-pawn. Rook e-a2, now knight comes back to a6, c6 rather, highlighting once again that this pawn on e5 is weak. Bishop e4 from white, but this finally allows black to capture on e5, going up a full pawn. Bishop takes c6 is met with rook takes d6. Now white regains this pawn in an opposite colored bishop endgame, but in this case it is nowhere near a draw. Rook d1 check, king e2, rook g1 hits the g2 pawn, so king e3. Now rook b1 is hitting the b pawn, rook a7 check, king f6, bishop d7. Fabi inserts this check, king e2. Now rook d8. Black has defended all of his pieces for the moment, and there's no comfortable way for white to actually guard this pawn. In fact, white simply plays rook c2, trying to stop this pawn in its tracks. If you play something like rook b7, well, you're just going to get hit with this move c3, and already it's going to be very, very difficult for you. You can't bring this king over to stop the pawn due to this tactic. So we just saw rook c2 instead, but this allows rook takes b4, and black is in fact up a comfortable pawn. Bishop c6, this pawn comes to c3, and after rook d7, we see rook c8, and Fabi gains some more space on this king side with h5 and h4. And after rook d1, king e5, getting the king into the game, we see a little bit of a repetition. And eventually, though, Fabi does decide he wants to win the game, plays bishop d2, and after rook a6, rook d8, rook c6, rook b1, black is just totally dominating the white pieces here. This rook comes into d4, this rook comes over to b4. There are a ton of ways to win this game, but the way Fabi did it is perfectly fine. This king comes into f4 now, and after king f2, we see the rooks double on the first rank, creating checkmating threats. Rook f8 check, the king drops back to e5. Now after bishop d3, the rook comes back up to b2. Once again, not quite the most efficient way to win, but perfectly fine for Fabi. King e2, is met with rook e1 check, king f2. Now rook c1 forces this rook to trade itself off. If you take on c1, you get hit with bishop takes c1 check. The king has to come to the first rank. And now you're going to get dominated with c2 and c1 to follow. So instead, we saw rook takes b2, c takes b2. Now rook b8 tries to stop the pawn from queening, but bishop c3, bishop e4. We give a check, and after king e2, king f4, rook b4, e5 defends the bishop, rook b7, and king g3 is the move that forced resignation from white. No way to keep all your pawns on the king's side, as well as stop this b-pawn. And so with this game, Fabi punched his ticket to the World Championship match in 2018 by defeating Alexander Grischuk, and he did so with a win in the final round. Very impressive stuff from Fabiano, and I wish him all the best in the 2020 candidates. I would love to see a big Fabi Magnus rematch at this year's World Championship. Well, thank you very much for joining me for this episode of Game Review. My name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.